And good morning, everybody. My name's Dave Lynch. I'm the city manager here in Newton Falls, Ohio, and thanks for tuning into our morning COVID-19 briefing. We've been doing these for a few weeks now, Monday through Saturday. We take the day off on Sunday, but the point is, right around 7:30 every morning, we do these briefings live on Facebook, YouTube, and of course on Spectrum channel 1023, live every morning, just to give you a very brief summary of what's going on in Newton Falls. You know, in the state of Ohio, folks are tuning into the governor's press conferences to get real information with reference to what Dr. Acton is saying. And of course, the president's task force, which sort of is on and off, but still we have federal authorities giving us instructions. Pay attention to that information. However, I thought it was important for all of us in Newton Falls to see how our businesses are coping, and we're all learning a little bit more about how to deal with the dynamics of the new COVID-19 environment, especially with the way things have been changing over the last few weeks as new directives that are, for lack of a better term, helping us to loosen things up in terms of our economy and our businesses goes forward. Well, one of the things that I've talked about is that information is king. And that's what helps guide us. And that means not putting our heads in the sand in terms of information that is maybe extraneous to what the governor has told us. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't pay attention to what the governor's saying and Dr. Acton is saying. But what it does mean is the best informed citizen in public is someone who has all the information. Then the citizen can make their own decisions. So one of the things that we're about to talk about to some extent with our first guest reminds me of the story of the emperor's clothes. And everybody knows that story, that everybody in the kingdom was afraid to tell the truth, that the emperor's brand new clothing is actually no clothing at all. The emperor is naked, but because out of a sense of fear of recrimination and retribution, nobody will say anything except for one little boy who tugs on his mom's coat and says loudly, "Hey, the emperor's naked. He doesn't have any clothes." And of course, everyone's horrified, but it dawns on them that this little child is speaking the truth. Well, we have our first guest who is not a little child, but what he is he's an independent investigative reporter. And he's been getting traction throughout the state of Ohio and also nationally because he uses his own eyes and his own ears, and he tugs on his mother's coat and says, there is information in Ohio that Ohioans need to know, and people nationally need to know, so that we can be informed. He doesn't have an axe to grind, except for the fact that he's out there letting us learn more independent information, and that is independent investigative reporter from WFMD in Mansfield, Jack Windsor, on our live line. Good morning, Jack. How are you?
David, I'm super fantastic. Thank you for having me. It's great to talk with you and, of course, the folks at Newton Falls.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming on. I've been working on this for actually trying to get a hold of you for a few weeks because I first learned about you from one of our residents by the name of Brian Kropp, and I've been following the things that you've been saying on your live Facebook broadcast and especially an article you wrote recently. But I guess before I get into the meat of that, what launched you on to some extent, what some might call a crusade? Now, I know you don't have an axe to grind in terms of personal motivation of any kind of bringing some kind of riches or grandeur to yourself, but what got you onto this? Because, you know, a lot of folks in the media seem to be hesitant, quite reticent when it comes to questioning what's coming out of Columbus.
That's a great question, and it's one I've been asked a lot. I've spent some time with news organizations, but what really lit my fire here, it's really two things, and I was talking with someone about this yesterday. Number one, it's my 7-year-old daughter, and I really genuinely believe that she has a right, and I have a right to afford her that right to grow up in the freest, greatest country in the world that I was able to enjoy as a kid. And I don't want to sound melodramatic, but I think we're not far away from a time and a place where we would look back if we didn't make the right decisions and go, oh my goodness, Do you remember how it used to be? So that's my passion point. I want to make sure that she inherits a world that was better than the one I inherited when I was a child. But the thing that I'm my only dog in the fight is truth. And like you and many others, I've sat through and listened during the press conferences, and I've gobbled up a ton of information. And there just always seemed to be this other avenue where things didn't always add up, or something would be said, and I'd scratch my head and go, "Gosh, that just doesn't sound like the whole picture." And so, the passion is giving a better world to my daughter, and the motive is finding the truth for Ohioans.
Yeah, well, Jack, you've developed a lot of different themes over the last few weeks, but I want to focus in particular right now on an article you published just a few days ago, and it had to do with true data that the governor's office was not accessing and maybe to some extent was ignoring. What's that story about? And by the way, folks, take a look at that article when you get a chance, and you'll see what Jack was talking about. It is a long article, but you have to read through the whole thing. And I'm sorry, folks, if there's a lot of data and a lot of content, but being informed means putting the time and energy in. Jack, tell us about that article. What's going on?
Well, I wrote the article because if you've listened to the press conferences, sometimes I ask some edgy questions. And those questions always come from our viewers and our listeners. And other questions started to pop up. I get hundreds throughout the week. And one pattern that I noted was it just seems like there are some gaps in information. As you said earlier at the beginning of this broadcast, we're in a time that we need real, accurate information. We've been told that the governor has said, look, if we get above an R naught of 1.2, for example, alarm bells are going to go off and we may have to roll things back. Well, if information is going to drive whether or not we can go to work, whether or not we can go back out, in open spaces and come out of our homes, then it's incumbent upon them to make sure that that information is accurate. So I put together this investigative report, and I go through the backdrop, how we got to where we are, and then several of the data points that I just have questions about. And I think it's important to note when this all happened in March, what we were seeing on the TV, what we were hearing, it was about the tragedy in northern Italy, and it looked awful. And when we rolled into this lockdown and lockout, I think most of us felt, it's probably going to be tough to do, but I get the decision. And a lot of people seem to be on board. But where it kind of started to go awry in the beginning is, if you remember the modeling was based on an Imperial College model from epidemiologist Neil Ferguson, and that model ended up being exponentially incorrect. It was predicting, I think, 60,000 or 62,000 new cases a day at one point. And then I believe Ohio State stepped in with the Ohio Director of Health, Acton, and they ratcheted that number down to 10,000 new cases a day, and then 2,000 new cases a day. So almost out of the gate, some of the data was really, or at least the modeling was off. And where I really started to scratch my head is on how deaths are reported. And this actually happened over the holiday weekend. But when you watch the presser, Amy Acton will often say, deaths reported in the last 24 hours. Deaths reported in the last 24 hours are different than the actual number of deaths in the last 24 hours. And it was a shining example to me over Memorial Day weekend, when on the 23rd, the Ohio Department of Health reported 84 deaths over a 24-hour period. The actuality was there were 7. So there was a difference of 77 deaths. And the challenge with that, and then I'll tell you kind of how to get there. The challenge in that is it's confusing. It's confusing to journalists. It's confusing. I know what's going on, and I read a headline and I got anxious. Here's the headline I read: deaths more than double the previous 24-hour period. And so that information goes out, people read it, and people panic. Yeah. I mean, rightfully so. But when you go back, there's a CSV file on the state dashboard that you can dive into. We're talking about a difference of 77 deaths. Now, here's why that happens. Because they report those deaths in one day, and they may go all the way back to the beginning of this pandemic, March, January. So that's just one small example. And I'll pause there because I'm sure you have some questions.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that because the numbers can be misleading if they're stated, especially in a headline, the way you've described it. One of the other data points that was striking to me in your article was the fact that the state of Ohio at one point was saying, my gosh, we've got a certain percentage of deaths emanating from nursing homes, and it was I'll call it a modest percentage, I think around 20%. And then your article demonstrated the fact that the real number was closer to 79 or 80%. And there's a lot of meaning in the focus in terms of deaths coming out of nursing homes, because the way my sum and substance review of your article is this: if we had had the real data information, we didn't have to lock down the way we did. We had to take some precautions, but all the suffering and grief and businesses shut down might have been avoided if we had acted upon the real data. Is that a way of saying things?
You know, I think that's definitely a perspective to look at. And I think that probably comes out in the article. And I think you hit the nail on the head with the premise that, look, if we had the real data, if we had all of the data, and you mentioned nursing homes. Look, 2 weeks ago, Amy Acton estimated death rates in nursing homes were about 20%. I think she said 22% of the overall death toll. And a reporter said, well, wait a minute. We know that you started reporting on April 15th, and just from April 15th forward, we're calculating 40%. Well, at that point, it was actually 69. And then on May 21st, confirmed deaths in nursing homes totaled 79%. And here's why the interesting part about that is they were actually segregating data on nursing homes and prisons. But what's just startling to me is that there was not the understanding of how high the death toll was, the percentage of it. And when you think about that, and you really, you figure out, all right, if we're talking about congregate living and nursing homes, we're talking about 1% of our population, less than 1% actually of our population. And in less than 1% of our population, we're getting almost literally 80% of, the worst outcome. And so I mentioned that's the most immobile part of our population. They're residents in nursing homes. You can identify where they are. They're not going anywhere. You can go there. You can test them, and you can treat them. And how we didn't understand that there were that many deaths coming from the nursing home. The information was published, but it wasn't accurately published. But then, two, why didn't we, use a scalpel instead of a wrecking ball of policy? I mean, if you know that 80% of something is coming from 1%, doesn't it make sense then to laser focus on that segment and solve the problem? And here's the example I give, and then I'll be quiet again.
That's right.
If you're a first responder and you show up to a scene, and there are five people that have had just been in an accident, 4 of them seem okay. One of them might be injured. The other one is in critical, near fatal condition and is bleeding out. Now, do you know what a first responder is trained to do? They're trained to go over to that person who's in critical condition and bleeding out and put a tourniquet on that person and save that life. And then they go into their secondary and tertiary protocol to deal with the other 4 people at the accident scene. Why didn't we do that with our policy?
Yeah, it's I think they call that the triage system, and it really does make sure you have your immediate expending of resources on the critical cases. And then certainly that's the reason why if you go into an emergency room and you're bleeding, you might go to the front of the line before Joe Flabovitz, who's got a sore throat. Jack, one other thing about this is the fact is we now have real life data from real experiences in other countries and to some extent other states who utilize this more scalpel-like methodology, and they've had as much success, if not more success, than we've had in Ohio. Is that a fair statement?
It is, and I think there are a lot of states and a lot of countries that the one that many people point to is Florida. I think South Carolina is one,
Sure.
and then the Dakotas, and then you certainly can look at Texas. Now Sweden has taken a lot of the limelight. Sweden, they will admit that they didn't get it right with congregate living out of the gate, but they've had more relaxed lockdowns, and you can still look at the numbers. There's still stuff going on. But it does seem that areas that had more relaxed standards and were laser focused had a better result. And here's the other thing that we know. The alarming part from New York a couple of weeks ago, the governor there even said, look, we're looking at this, and 66% of our new cases are coming from people who are on lockdown. So I think there could have been a better way. We knew early on, by the way, I published that in the article. We knew early on from Italy and China, the group that was going to be hardest hit. We knew that before we signed the first order. It was going to be 79 years and above, especially if there were comorbidities. But other people who have heart disease or diabetes or high blood pressure would be at risk. Maybe some accelerated risk. But really, it was the 60 and above, but particularly the 79 and above. Look, we knew that from day one.
Yeah. State Representative Nino Vitale has been leading the charge towards there being a more common sense approach to dealing with this issue as it relates to the actual data. And I guess the real question that I've heard him ask, and I'll ask you, is what do you think is going on? How did we get in the spot where it may be that we've created a solution which isn't really applicable to the problem based on the data that we know? I mean, how did we get to this spot? What's motivating people, I guess, is the question I'm asking you, if you can sort of look into your crystal ball and figure that out.
Yeah, I could go down several different paths here. But what I'll say is this. I've always wanted to give the administration the benefit of the doubt.
Sure.
I think the thing that they may struggle with, and I'm speaking for DeWine and Acton and Husted, and it's hard for me to do that because they're all individuals and they all have their own drivers,
Sure.
to behavior. But we all struggle with confirmation bias. We all struggle with, hey, I think this, and so now I'm going to try to prove it. The guy who came up with the Imperial College model, he's whiffed multiple times in his life, and he's stuck with models. And so it's one of those things where, I mean, if you put yourself in, let's say, the government's shoes, he came out and he took a chance. I mean, if you remember back early in March, he canceled the Arnold Classic. I mean, that was a big deal. People went, what's going on
I was
here?
in Columbus that particular weekend, and there was no topic higher on the list of things to talk about in Columbus, Ohio, than that order to stop the Arnold Schwarzenegger event.
Yeah, and so he rolled out. That was a big deal. And then soon thereafter, we canceled an election, postponed it, and then we went into the shelter in place. He received a ton of attention, if you remember that. It was positive. In fact, his ratings around the state of Ohio across party lines were extremely high because people thought, hey, we were not certain. It makes sense. And then he kind of started hitting the national media circuit, right? And I think it could be a combination of confirmation bias. I think it could be, maybe he likes the limelight, and he was at one point, it felt like he was America's governor, right?
Yeah.
But now he's in this awkward situation. A couple of weeks ago, we heard that his approval is about 80%. I was involved, meaning I tracked an online independent news survey from last week, and those numbers have dramatically dipped. In fact, those who are in favor of and approve of the policies are at about 30% now, according to that survey. But he's in this awkward position. He's a governor, and Husted's a lieutenant governor, and Acton is a medical professional. And for them to stand up and say, "Hey, look, we completely whiffed on this," there's risk in that.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you something.
Sure.
You understand this. We live in a great country where people love a comeback story, and people love to give people a second chance. If he were to stand up today and say, "Look, we really We really kind of messed up on these things. We're going to try to turn around the Titanic and make this right. I can't speak for everybody, but I think most Ohioans would go, you know what, we're on board with that, Governor. Let's do it.
Yeah.
Right now, there are a lot of people who are fed up with the fact that they feel like the policy does not match the current situation.
Well, it's interesting you say that. They're concerned about the policy not matching the situation because I'm going to quote a little bit Judge Eugene Lucci in the case of the physical fitness exercise locations versus Dr. Acton. In granting a temporary restraining order, in paragraph 37 of his decision, he describes Dr. Acton's actions as arbitrary, vague, and capricious. And this is from a guy who wears robes and is judicious because he's a judge, and yet use language like that. Did that cause people to raise eyebrows when they saw that language?
From where I was sitting and what I was seeing, it absolutely did. It was almost a celebratory type of moment, particularly for business owners, particularly for people who have felt like the policy didn't match the data. And, the other thing that he said along the lines of what you just shared, which, by the way, I love what you read there. He also said the director, Acton, has no statutory authority to close all businesses, including the plaintiff's gyms. She has acted impermissibly, arbitrary, you're right, unreasonable, in an oppressive manner without procedural safeguards.
Yes.
He said all businesses. She stepped over the line with all businesses. And, on the 21st, the governor kind of shrugged it off and said, well, basically they've just made us accelerate things 6 days. No, they said that it was arbitrary, unreasonable, and oppressive, and there was no authority to close all businesses. All businesses mean all businesses. So I'm really curious about how this is going to continue to extend. The problem is, as Nino would say, he calls them this. He calls them the goon squad. These are the people that are going to come out to your business, particularly if you're a restaurant or a bar, and make sure that you're in compliance. And my understanding is, based on some really strong language the governor used over the past couple of weeks, they will give you a citation. It could be an administrative infraction. It could be a criminal infraction. Look, you could lose your business license. We know that you could be facing a $750 fine, 90 days in jail. That's all pretty serious stuff in light of the fact that a judge in Lake County said what he said. And again, to me, that's just blatant disregard for the judiciary. By the way, it happened the night before the election, if you remember. Judge Fry out of Franklin County said, we're not going to postpone this.
Yeah.
And so what they did was they pulled a legal lever by having Acton say that, no, we can't have that. It's an emergency situation we're in, and it's unhealthy for people to go to the polls and vote.
Yeah, Judge Fry and Judge Lucci, by the way, have reputations as being very strict law and order judges. In other words, they do not take lightly the concept of telling folks that a higher authority in Columbus lacks the right to do some of the things they're doing. So I was especially, it made an impression on me that Judge Fry and Judge Lucci, who have these reputations, came out, and they're very pensive, deliberate, thoughtful judges. They're well known for opinions that are not these just one-line opinion saying follow my order. They tend to develop very fully the argumentation of the parties and to cite the law that's involved. In fact, what Judge Lucci wrote to me was reminiscent of kind of what happened in Wisconsin. I guess the question that I've been asking myself is, if we really do rely on the accurate data, we've got the opportunity, I won't say that the terminology reverse course, but maybe to modify the draconian nature of the things that are being imposed. Do you see a little light at the end of the tunnel in terms of the state administration modifying its approach to things, Jack?
I'm still kind of reserving judgment on that. And I'll say a couple things on that. One, we hear that the economy is 90, 95% open, and it's not. There are still restaurants and businesses and shops that cannot open because they cannot comply. And by the way, if you're a restaurant and you have to be cut down to 50% capacity, that's not 95% open. That's 50% open. And when you have servers who are relying at 50% of their income on a tip, and now you've cut their ability to produce income in half. So, and you could probably dive deeper in every segment of the business and find anecdotal stories or real stories like that to give a compelling argument that we're not as open as you say we are. That's number one. And number two, the data is there. If people had really, if they'd given credence to what they discovered a couple of weeks ago, I think we'd be in a different boat. I tried to do that a little bit. And what I'm talking about is we know that this was here in January. Over Memorial Day weekend, the state CSV file actually had a case posted indicating that this was here, when I say this, COVID-19, in December. So thinking about that, what if it was December? Some people in my area, Richland County, Ashland County, think this was here before Thanksgiving. But let's just go with the data that they have. This was here in January and February and into the end of March with an R naught, or a contagion factor of 2.5 to 5. So it ran unmitigated for almost 3 months. We didn't have hospitals that were over capacity. We didn't have massive numbers of deaths. We didn't have the spike that they told us out of the gate that we were going to have. And look, they said out of the gate, we're going to try to flatten this curve of 62,000 new cases a day, which, by the way, that stuff, and then when they revised it down to 10, it accounted for the measures. And we never even came close. And the social contract they gave us in the beginning, because DeWine used that word a lot, was flatten the curve and build capacity. And what they thought was going to happen in the beginning never even came close to happening. And now we're 11 weeks in, and the noose and the lockdowns are tighter. It just doesn't make sense. So I don't know. To me, it doesn't make sense that we are as slow rolling out of this lockout. And it doesn't make sense that there are, given the data that we have about the spread and contagion and who it affects, it doesn't make sense to me that we have strapped businesses with these policies and with these mandates. But I'm a reporter. I'm going to stay off that side of it. But, sure. A lot of adults that I hear from feel like I'm an adult and I want the ability to make my decision and, trust me to do the right thing. They had to trust people to roll into this lockout to begin with. Why can't they be more trustworthy with better data that says it's not as bad as they thought it was going to be?
Yeah, Jack, in response to that, I have noticed that some of the people charged with enforcing a lot of these directives here in Ohio and elsewhere in the country are not exactly enthusiastic about doing the enforcement. And in fact, in some parts of the country, those that have been asked to enforce these orders have essentially either refused to do so, or they have done so in a way that basically expresses the fact that they don't think that the concept of being an American means coming down hard on our fellow citizens. You've seen some of that, haven't you?
I have. There was one that I didn't get to watch a second time. I was going to a press conference. Somebody sent it to me, gave me goosebumps. I got choked up. I think it was involving a gym where I think it was a gym. The law enforcement officials show up, and there's a big crowd around them, and the officer says, "Hey, we're here because you're in violation. Have a good day." And they walk away.
Yeah, I saw
that. And
the
crowd
video
goes
too.
Absolutely nuts. That's a tough spot. I've talked to some officers around the state of Ohio off the record, and they're in a really, really tough spot. It's a no-win.
Yeah.
Simply because if you look at the pledge that they make, right, they're committing to uphold the Constitution.
Sure.
And some folks take that extremely seriously. And now if you put them in a situation where it doesn't matter the outcome, if you have somebody that is tattling and the officer goes to the person that's being tattled on, the person that's being tattled on, people have smartphones, that's going to get recorded. And that, so somebody's angry there. Or if the officer blows off or doesn't do what the person, turning in the business or tattling on another person wants that officer to do, then that ends up becoming a storm for law enforcement.
Yeah.
So they're in a really, really tough spot.
Yeah. Well, you know, Jack, I think I'm with you from the standpoint that I'm giving all of our officials in Ohio the benefit of the doubt in terms of their motivation. I think there's a sense of caring, a sense of concern, and oftentimes I think people in government will take a position that is almost done in an overkill because they're so concerned about the danger that lurks that they want to nail down absolutely any and every possibility of that danger creeping into our communities. And unfortunately, that leads to a lack of balance. And, you know, what some people have said is the essence of being a free American means not letting the government control every aspect of our lives. And I've heard some people say what's happened in America is a sense of martial law was declared. And of course, nobody in government wants to use that terminology, but you know, a Soviet-style state is something that we spent a lot of years trying to avoid during the Cold War, and hopefully things will loosen up, and we'll have an opportunity to live our lives in a greater sense of freedom once again. Jack, thank you so very much on behalf of the citizens in Ohio, on behalf of folks all throughout the country. It's not easy to stick your neck out that way, and I'm sure for the governor, you're the sort of the Sam Donaldson. You know, President Reagan used to avoid Sam Donaldson like a plague, but he couldn't do it. And the fact is that folks in Ohio are not able to avoid the sword of truth that's being wielded by Jack Windsor, WFMD. We've put your phone number on the screen over at the TV station and your email, jackw@wfmd.com. And we've had some screenshots that instruct folks to catch your live Facebook broadcast. And just on behalf of our community here in Newton Falls, thanks for taking the time with us today, Jack.
David, it was an honor. Thank you to the folks of the city of Newton Falls. Stay strong, and God bless you all. Thank you.
All right. Good health to you, Jack. We'll see you. Bye now. Well, folks, if that wasn't an exchange, by the way, that's probably the longest broadcast that we have had, but maybe in some ways the most important. I want to again thank one of our citizens, Brian Kropp, who's called a lot of this information to my attention. Brian and I have disagreed on a number of issues, and I dare say we're going to disagree again. But, you know, disagreement is about the free exchange of ideas without necessarily meaning that you yourself are attributing evil motives to the person you disagree with. It's agreeing to disagree and having respect for one another and putting information out there in a way that respects the source of the information, even if it doesn't support the narrative that you think is important. So, Brian, thanks for letting me have access to the Jack Windsor information. And folks, stay in touch with that information because it puts things in perspective and maybe will help you make better decisions as you encounter the things that we're asked to do as we go through this reopening during this very difficult time. Well, that brings us to the close of another broadcast. As I mention all the time, folks, rely on your faith in God. He's up there in his heaven, and there's nothing wrong with pausing in prayer. You know, there's an old phrase from war, and that phrase is, there are no atheists in foxholes. What it means is in time of difficulty and stress, it's part of human nature to turn to a greater power, and we certainly can do that in prayer in Newton Falls. And we are a pretty religious community in Newton Falls. Well, as I mention all the time, folks, the situation is serious, but it's getting better. God bless America, and God bless the city of Newton Falls.